Hey everybody, I'm Jesse Lee, Online Programs Director here at the White House. Thanks again for joining us. Always happy to work with Ustream. We'll keep an eye on the chat in here, take your questions. I'm here with Austin Goolsbee. We're talking about Wall Street reform. The president gave a major speech in New York City just yesterday, and took some questions in advance off of Facebook also. So leave your questions in the chat. We'll get to some of the questions before. And Austin, you want to say just a couple words on the speech yesterday?
Well, the president went back to Cooper Union in New York, where he was more than 2 years ago, before Lehman failed, before the big crisis began, and he unfortunately had to be delivering the same message, which was we really, really need to reform the regulatory system that supervises our financial institutions. Back then, he was saying we need to do this so that we don't have a big financial crisis. We had that financial crisis, and now the time has come to bring this thing into the hangar and be done with it. The president outlined several key aspects. I'm sure people may ask about some of them, but essentially it's let's end the system of bailouts. Let's protect consumers. Let's get derivatives out of the dark and out into the open. Let's limit the risky activities that banks can take. And let's get to a situation which is better for financial institutions themselves and for the economy in the long run, which is we got strong oversight laying out rules of the road, and we grow from there. So I think everybody's pretty hopeful that we're going to get a regulatory reform, that we're going to do that in a bipartisan way, because I think, maybe not the leadership, but ordinary members of Congress, I think they're going to look at the bill. They're going to say, this is exactly what we need. The financial institutions ought to pay to clean up their mess, not the American people.
All right. We'll start with something we got off Facebook earlier. It was from Katie Reeves. What steps would be taken to prevent Wall Street from creating products like CDOs that regulators and other people do not even understand?
Well, this is what Katie's raising here is one of the things that went dreadfully wrong and caused this financial crisis. We had a massive proliferation of super complex instruments, and these CDOs, most of the worst ones, were based on subprime or Alt-A or other mortgages. And so I'd say there are at least 3 steps in the chain to prevent stuff like that from blowing up. The first is you establish the most robust, most comprehensive consumer protection for financial products that we have ever had in this country. So you would have cleaned up the first layer of mortgages, and they would not have been able to engage in some of the practices that they were engaged in that put the mortgages at risk. Second, in this bill, for securitizations, which are things like these instruments are based on, the creator of the security would have to retain some ownership. So what happened in this crisis is people would generate these things based on, say, mortgages that they knew were going to fail, but they would just sell them off. They got paid right off the bat, and then they couldn't care less whether they were going to default or not. We have to get away from that model, so the people who create it got to retain some ownership so that they've got the quote-unquote skin in the game and have an incentive to make sure that the right people are getting the money. And then the third is that there's a layer of the regulator looking at the institutions and looking at what banks are allowed to do in the course of what's called the Volcker Rule, which would make sure that companies had enough money on their balance sheets so that if something goes wrong, they've got the capital there to back themselves up, and that there are certain kinds of risky things that they would be doing that they wouldn't be allowed to do. So I think with a series of steps would help us prevent some of that stuff from blowing up.
All right. And one of the reasons I like doing it with Austin here is he's a tough guy, and he could take questions like this from Brett Holbert earlier. Why are you trying to expand the stranglehold this oppressive regime has on this country and on business?
Well, thank you for your comments, Brett, and thank you for taking the time to listen to our questions. Obviously, we're going to have a little bit of a disagreement if, and I know Brett there are a lot of people who think that way. I don't see how you can look at the last 8 years, and even before that, the massive ripping up the rules of the road that took place, which directly led to the financial crisis, and say, well, we really ought to stick with the status quo or loosen up the rules of the road even more, that somehow they had a stranglehold on the financial system. To me, that's almost the opposite of what happened. They stopped minding the store and the carjackings began. You got to have rules of the road. You got to make sure that we have free and fair competition. Now, nobody, and the president made clear that he does not believe that we in any way should have the government running the financial system. The only way we got into this situation, that we had to bail out some of these people, and the bailouts which began under the last administration exist only because the system failed completely. That's why we need a new system. It doesn't hurt, as I said at the outset, and as the president said in New York. It doesn't hurt the free market. It doesn't undermine your belief in capital markets or private business that you have sensible oversight of the financial system. In fact, it's completely vital that you have it. The thing that undermined the private sector more than anything else was that the public completely lost trust in financial markets and pulled all their money out. That's what led to the financial crisis. So, I appreciate Brett's comments, but I think he's off base on that one.
Right. Yeah, not to overstep my moderator role here, but an analogy that occurred to me the other day was when you looked at baseball and the whole steroids controversy. When there were loopholes in the rules and the testing and everything, you had a situation where some players were using it and the other players felt like they had to do it just to compete. And
right.
That's not a good situation for
Right.
even the players themselves.
That's not good for the players, and you saw a similar dynamic in this boom time where the folks that were cutting the corners the most, they were making great money because gaming the system was extremely profitable if nobody's enforcing the rules. And in a world like that, you're punishing the people for playing by the rules because they got to compete against people who aren't. So without setting the rules of the road, you're gonna be on a path for problems.
All right. One question we got from Lisa Fisher in the chat, and maybe you can give some context on what she's talking about here too, because it's been a big debate. Is what other options exist for funding the $50 billion wind down fund if it is removed because of legislative compromise? Okay,
this is a key point for anybody who hadn't been following this in detail. This legislation that's winding through Congress that they're going to vote on has had a pre-funded $50 billion fund. Now, that fund was a bipartisan idea that Republicans and Democrats had come up with expressly so that taxpayers would not be on the hook for any kind of money that might be needed in a financial crisis. This is important on two dimensions. One, no taxpayer money, period. The banks pay that money out of their own pockets. And two, that cannot be used for a bailout. Forbidden, outlawed to be used for propping up any financial institution. The money can only be used for funeral expenses, for liquidating the company or breaking it up into pieces and selling it off with the management fired and the shareholders wiped out. That's what the pre-funding was. Now, the president feels extremely strongly that banks must pay for the messes that they create, not the American taxpayer. If we don't want to do that pre-funded, we can do it post-funded. But the key principle is that it's got to be the financial institutions paying, not the taxpayer. So there are a number of different ways you could do that, but as long as we make that point clear, and as long as we cannot use the money for bailouts and prop-ups, the president's open to all sorts of different ideas.
All right, and one of the things that a lot of this debate was initially about was the new agency to protect consumers. And that's something that's been kind of left out of from a lot of the debate lately. This relates to it from Manish Pangasa. He says, President Obama, please urge Congress to include payday lending reform measures in your financial reform bill.
Well, look, Manish has got a good point that when you look at consumer protection, there's a whole variety of things. We have talked in this very spot about credit card reforms and all of the things that the Consumer Protection Agency and the credit card bill have done to protect consumers from outrageous fees and various practices some of these card issuers have. There are a bunch of things on mortgages. If you've ever bought a house, you know there's 100 pages of documents, and even if you're a lawyer, you can't even understand what a lot of it says. But payday lenders, check cashing services, a whole bunch of consumer financial products need to be encompassed in this thing. There was a bill in the House which had an exemption for payday lenders. My understanding is there's no such exemption in the legislation that we're going forward. I think Manish is onto something. We got to incorporate that.
That's right, and I'll try to drop a link to this in the chat, but if you search whitehouse.gov for payday lenders, you'll quickly find a blog post from our Deputy Communications Director, Jen Psaki, making clear that the President has a clear line on this,
yes.
And he's not going to tolerate a carve-out for that. Speaking of which, Zach, I won't try to pronounce the last name, but he says, please provide a summary of what's in the bill for the populace to read so we can know the truth. And I'll say, this is also on whitehouse.gov. You can find it pretty quickly. I'll give the URL, but why don't you give just kind of a brief outlay of the kind of key sections of this? Okay,
I'll give you a few points, but I'd encourage anybody interested in this to go to the White House website and read about it, because you can get more detail than I'm going to be able to say. I think several of the most important points on this are, number one, establishing the strongest, most comprehensive consumer protection agency in U.S. financial history. We've never had something as strong as that. It consolidates what is currently spread out over 7 different agencies and is not the central focus of any of those agencies, consolidates it all into one central place where both the regulator can be held accountable and the financial companies can be held accountable. Second thing it's going to do is end the too big to fail regime, end bailouts, period. Bailouts are outlawed. If we ever get into trouble, the financial company must be liquidated or broken up. All the managers get fired and all the shareholders lose their money. It's extremely important that we do that. That's what's called this resolution authority, which is the nice way to say wipe these guys out, which is we resolve them and we resolve their problems. Third, it looks at derivatives, the $600 trillion market for what are called over-the-counter derivatives, which are derivatives that trade in the dark, that we know nothing about and are virtually unregulated. The president's insisted that we get those out of the dark, into the sunlight, and under the regulatory umbrella. We wouldn't normally care because you say, who trades in that? And regular people don't trade in derivatives. But everybody's perked up real quick when AIG, because of these dark pools of derivatives, required hundreds of billions of dollars from the U.S. government. Otherwise, they threaten to blow up the entire financial system. So we've got to move the derivatives out. The Volcker rule would limit the ability of banks and financial institutions to grow too big as a share of the whole system, and would restrict what official banks are allowed to do. That if you have access to the FDIC and the safety net, which is provided by the American people, you shouldn't be using that subsidy to just invest for your own account in your own speculative investment. So it would prevent that. And the president has also, as he said in his Cooper Union speech, been out front on giving shareholders more say to express their voice on the compensation of the leaders of financial institutions and other public companies. So I'd say those are some key points, but there are many others. It's pretty comprehensive legislation, but those ones are pretty important.
All right. Let's see. Jay Thomas said, Geithner briefly discussed stockholder oversight in the bill yesterday morning. Please elaborate.
Okay, I assume that means the stockholder oversight on executive compensation. So that's the say on pay type legislation, which would give shareholders the ability to voice a vote of no confidence, shall we say, on the compensation packages of management. Now, the president in his remarks at Cooper Union said neither he nor the government nor anybody begrudges managers and executives who get paid for their performance. I think what's confused a lot of people is to look at the years these financial companies have had. How could that be termed performance? Why are they getting paid what they're getting paid when they had these epically bad years and they threatened to blow up the entire economy? This would give shareholders the right to say, hey, wait a minute, we think this is a bad idea. There are a few companies now that have voluntarily adopted these say on pay resolutions, and the board of directors take those extremely seriously. You know, if your shareholders say, we think this person is being paid too much in the wrong form, is not being rewarded for performance, they're being rewarded for messing things up, they have a chance to express that.
All right. Now this one's a little wonky for me, so maybe you can de-wonk it a little bit. C.T. Meyer asked, how can we equitably clarify asset valuation without returning to mark-to-market accounting?
Okay. This gets into some accounting rules. Why don't I take a step back? Instead of getting into the technicals, take a step back. One of the things that happened here is we ceased to be able to trust the numbers that were coming out. And people were hiding things. This is on both sides that this matters. On one side, as the market collapsed, banks started having to value their assets, marking to market, they call it, value the assets. And as the prices are plunging, the rating agencies are saying, wait, maybe you're not in as good a shape as we thought, so we're going to downgrade you. The other banks lending them money, or money market funds, various people that lend money to banks that they loan out, say, they kind of panicked. And that led to the financial crisis, that people said, if we can't trust the numbers, we don't know if we want to give you our money. I think a lot of this financial reform is about ways to reestablish the public trust, ways to hold accountable not just the banks, but the regulators, the rating agencies, a number of others. So that will give them an incentive to provide fully accurate information. And that helps get you around some of this mark-to-market problem.
All right, and that actually leads into a kind of broader, I think, very intuitive question, which is how will this reform function if the next administration appoints a fox to guard the henhouse?
Well, if you appoint, we've learned repeatedly throughout the history of the country, unfortunately, that if you appoint people who are explicitly trying to get rid of regulations or to not enforce regulations that are on the book, that are on the books, you're in a tough spot. I mean, one way to get around that is to make explicit rules that would be in the law. But even then, if people are going to actively try to undermine those laws, I think it's hard. You're in a hard spot. In my view, the most effective way to get the regulators to do what is intended in the law is to put in place a system where they can be held accountable. So if you take consumer protection in the Consumer Protection Agency, as I mentioned, right now those functions are spread over 7 different agencies, and in none of those 7 agencies is this the main thing they do. So if you're the bank regulator at the OCC and you have a consumer protection within your body, but the main thing you do is bank regulation, you're going to have a tendency to kind of skimp on that. because nobody's butt is in the seat and being held accountable. If you have a consumer protection agency where there's somebody appointed whose job is to protect consumers, and if credit card companies start abusing the law or not following what's in the credit card bill, they'll go to that person and say, what are you doing? The law states that they must observe A, B, and C practices, and they're not doing it. And ultimately, that's the public pressure that can get the foxes to settle down, if they're in charge of the hen house.
All right, I think that was a great explanation. We're going to take one more question. I don't know if it's a softball. It kind of is. But Dave LaRose asked on Facebook earlier, Austin Goolsbee on-the-job training knows nothing and is helping to ruin our country. But then look at all the other fools working for the administration.
That's our last question. Thanks a lot. Well, first of all, Dave, let me say that wasn't phrased as a question, so I don't have to answer it.
Well, the reason I wanted to ask is, a lot of times we have these chats and people don't actually know much about the bio of the person sitting here answering the question. So why don't you talk a little bit about kind of your expertise and maybe a little bit about the very long process that it took to get this bill developed and get to where we are now.
Okay, I am an economics professor from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. I'm on leave. I'm at the Council of Economic Advisors, which is made up of economists who are on leave from universities and economic experts in different areas. We took part in the formulation of the financial regulatory white paper / blueprint, which came out last summer. I'm also the chief economist of the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board, which is headed by Paul Volcker and comprised of a number of financial experts and regulators. You got Roger Ferguson was vice chair of the Fed, Bill Donaldson was head of the SEC, Volcker himself was head of the Fed, obviously. And so we have tried to bring in experts from all different venues within the economy, within the financial system, academics, policymakers, regulators, when we formulated what the key principles would be. And the financial crisis started more than 2 years ago. So as I say on this legislation, we have been talking for a long time, debating the issues. It's time to bring that to an end. I think the sentiments that we're a fool and we know nothing, look, everybody's entitled to their opinion. I think we have tried as administration to reach out to bring in all sorts of viewpoints and to try to distill that into something that would work and protect the system. As a last note, I guess what I'd say is the financial institutions and a few of the financial institutions and a few of the special interests are lobbying as hard as they can. They have spent hundreds of millions of dollars. They have hired 5 lobbyists per member of Congress trying to put loopholes back into this regulatory reform, trying to protect the status quo that has been extremely generous and extremely lucrative to a very small number of institutions. We cannot afford to do that, where the we is not the administration, it's the American people and the economy. We cannot afford to let this go back to what it was that got us into this mess. If you look out the window, more than 8 million people have lost their jobs in this recession, deepest since the Depression, and they've lost their jobs in a recession fueled by financial crisis. So say what you want about me, but together we have got to do this. And I think ultimately everyone knows that. Even the financial institutions themselves know that we can't go back to the status quo because that's what got them into crisis, not just the economy. So I hope that everybody will go to whitehouse.gov. We'll read about the bill. We'll talk to their leadership, Congress, anyone about their concerns that we reform the financial system and prevent this kind of thing from happening again. And I appreciate your time watching.
All right. Yep. Thanks so much. And thanks so much, Austin. Look forward to doing it again.